So welcome everyone for another episode of Confabulating. Today, and before we start our interview with Dr. Lucia Gunning, we will be doing a minute of silence because two professors that we have in Portugal, which they are quite a big and give a big contribute for historiography in Portugal. So we will be doing a minute of silence in memory of them. Now em português, just for our viewers. Vamos fazer um minuto de silêncio. Tivemos o falecimento de dois professores que foram muito importantes para a historiografia portuguesa e, como tal, vamos dedicar este minuto a eles e em sua homenagem. E o minuto vai começar a partir de agora. So the minute of silence will start from now. And thank you for everything you have gave to us. Obrigado por tudo que estes dois mestres nos deram. Obrigado. Well, now let's go for our conversation. So thank you so much, Professor Lucia Gunning, for accepting to be with us here tonight. Just to do a brief presentation, Professor Lucia Gunning is a lecturer teaching at UCL History. Is a modern historian specializing in cultural heritage with a particular focus on the history of collecting for European museums. Her research interests cover social, cultural, and diplomatic history. She specializes in museum formation, state involvement in the collection of antiquities in the 19th century, and its implication on contemporary issues of collecting and restitution. She has experience on the protection of heritage at risk, especially post-earthquakes, including the use of information technology to empower communities and reconnect them to their cultural heritage. Her areas of interest, research, and expertise also cover the ethics of collecting and the position and nature of museums in today's globalized society. Welcome, Dr. Lucia Gunning. Welcome. And
thank you. Thank you. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and share my screen with you. And disabled participant screen sharing. So you need to allow me to.
I do apologize, and you will be able to share your screen now.
Okay, so share screen, advanced portion of screen. Why is it not? So it's not. Hang on a second. Let's have a look.
Yeah,
okay.
You can see the screen.
Yeah, but you can't see the right thing yet.
Not yet.
The problem I have is that if it does this and doesn't move, I will not be able to move my presentation. Hold on a second. Like this is not centered, is it?
Well, no,
No.
it's a little bit to the right, but do you have
Okay.
like an option?
No,
Do you have like
it's
an
doing
option?
it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it's doing it. Can you see the
Yeah,
picture?
yeah, we can.
We use Team more than Zoom, so I'm
Oh,
used
okay.
to,
Sorry about
and it has slightly distorted the picture, but doesn't matter. It's okay. This will do. Okay, so hello everybody. So my name is Lucia Patrizio Gunning, and as Yao said, I'm a lecturer at the History Department at University College London. The focus of my research is the history of collecting and information of museums, and so this is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So can you see it? Or,
Yeah, everything is perfect.
Okay. So I came to this with my PhD research, which covered or wanted to investigate the functions of the British Consular Service in the Aegean. And this was published into a book in 2009, republished in 2018. And the book revealed the extensive connections between diplomacy and the collection of antiquities for the British Museum. Over the past few years, I've also taught students about the history of collecting and cabinet of curiosities, and encyclopedic, from cabinets of curiosities to encyclopedic museums. I need to change the way I see. Okay. Can you see me still?
Perfectly fine.
Okay, good, because I wasn't able to see part of my screen. So so I was saying, from cabinet of curiosities to the development of encyclopedic museums in the 18th and 19th century. The course touched on the ethics of collecting, repercussion of historic collecting practices on the art market in the past and today, and explained the legislation relating to the protection of antiquities. So those, in fact, are the core of the points I focus my attention on. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the evolving relationship between government and the British Museum in the 19th century, and in particular about how diplomats and diplomacy played a key part in the development of the British Museum. And I will illustrate this with material from a research project that I carried out in 2019 as part of a 6-month pilot project financed by UCL Innovation and Enterprise, and done in conjunction with the British Museum Archives. But first, I need to give you a bit of background. So, the British Museum was established by an Act of Parliament on the 7th of June 1753, following the bequest to the nation of the private collection of Sir Hans Sloane. In his bequest, this is Sloane had stipulated that the collection should be held in perpetuity in its entirety and be freely available to the curious. He required that the museum should be curated by full-time specialists. So the British Museum opened its doors to the public for the first time on the 15th of January 1759 at Montague House in Bloomsbury. For those of you who have been there, it looks quite different today. That part was redone in 1850. The founding collections were Sloane's bequests, the Harley collection of manuscript, and the Cottonian Library. In 1757, King George II made an important gift. He donated his library and the privilege of copyright deposit, which established the basis for the later opening of the British Library. Therefore, the so-called foundation collections consisted mainly of manuscripts, books, and objects of natural history. There were not very many antiquities. And the first pieces of recognized international importance in this sense were acquired in 1772 when the British Museum acquired Sir William Hamilton's collection of Greek vases. Sir William Hamilton is this gentleman. He was British ambassador in Naples with a great passion for collecting, and he was of great influence to taste in this country. At the same time, or in parallel, in Paris, the Louvre had opened its doors on the 10th of August 1793 as the Musée de la République. Louis XVI originated the idea of creating a museum to show the substantial collections amassed by the French royal families through the years. But in the new republic, the institution was given a new target and new functions. The ecclesiastical properties were nationalized, those of the aristocracy and the royal families were confiscated, and the museum was used at this stage as an instrument that contrasted the decadence of the old forms of control with the democracy and public utility of the republic. But there was a message there. So having understood the immense political and educating potential of the museum, Napoleon set about conquering Europe and its treasures with a systematic campaign where war indemnities were levied in the form of precious objects. Advanced planning was essential. Commissioners studied travel diaries and accounts describing the works of art of churches, palaces, libraries, and collections of the occupied countries, and made lists of things they wanted. Thus, when conquering a country, shock troops were instructed to move in and direct themselves immediately to remove the works of art before the legitimate owners knew what was going on or had the time to hide them. So within the first few hours of storming into a town, its cultural treasures had already disappeared, according to a classified pre-prepared list. The transfer of property was subsequently legalized in the peace treaties, and the spoils were taken to the Louvre. This was part of an organized policy of accumulating what Napoleon called the archives of civilization in Paris to rewrite their histories in the spirit of the liberation of all nations. So Napoleon's museum soon became the richest and most splendid ever seen. And the French were and still are at the forefront of museum development. And the museum itself became an instrument of education and control. There was another message there, that although they had opened the National Museum some 33 years after the British, the French showed an incredible determination in using the state apparatus to acquire antiquities. So Napoleon's invasion of Egypt showed the full force of an organized government machine. When he sailed from France to conquer Egypt in 1798, together with the army, Napoleon transported a group of 180 people. And in this group, there were natural philosophers, draftsmen, painters, who were meant to sketch, record, and collect antiquities for the Louvre. However, his defeat in Egypt at the hands of the British in 1801 meant surrendering the antiquities acquired there. And this became the first significant collection of antiquities that arrived to the British Museum, comprising the Rosetta Stone, sarcophages, sculptures, and inscriptions. This was a turning point, which established the basis for an unprecedented race over the collection of antiquities that developed in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. It must be stressed that by contrast with the Louvre, up until this point, the collection of the British Museum, as I told you before, were limited in content and in scope and rather resembled a cabinet of curiosities. They were essentially the collection of one man plus gifts received here and there. The early 19th century was a lawless time with regard to the collection of antiquities, and this is a very important concept. Laws, regulations, and rules were non-existent, and the countries that held the antiquities were mostly subjugated by foreign powers. Therefore, their populations worried more about their future than about, more about their past than about their future. What did I say? I said exactly the opposite. Worried more about their future than their past. Sorry. So they didn't have the strength. And at this stage, in fact, and this is a precise moment in time in the 19th century where nothing was impossible, especially through the use of diplomacy, as we will see. Yet, whilst the Louvre was a democratic institution, if anything else in spirit, the British Museum was at this stage rather elitist. So you could only enter with a ticket, you had to be dressed in a certain way, the hours of entry were limited, it was only open to men initially, and so on, and of a certain social status. Where in France the revolution had marked a new way of imagining the world, in England the British Museum had happened almost out of chance, and only thanks to the donation and determination of Sir Ernest Sloane. And in fact, at this stage, the British government still had no exact vision for this museum. But it was due to the spirit of competition with the French that gradually it came to see this institution as a sign of national prestige, and could see how it could contribute to the cultural growth and education of its own population. So how did the British Museum come to collect its antiquities and become the institution we know today? The UCL grant allowed me to carry out 6 months of a pilot project with the British Museum Archives, which was focused on researching documents relating to diplomatic involvement in the collection of antiquities in the whole of the Ottoman territory, from the foundation of the British Museum in 1753 to the First World War. And tonight I have selected a few archival documents that will explain the gradual development of a system that allowed the museum to receive exceptional pieces, as well as the central archive. So the museum has a central archive, which is called the Museum Archive, and then each department has got its own archive. And I looked at documentation in the central archive, in the Greek and Roman antiquities archive, and in the departments of Egypt and Sudan and Middle East. And today I will use examples from the pilot project to illustrate the development of the connection between diplomats and the museum across this period. And this is what my talk will focus on. So the first example from my recent research project involved examining the private correspondence of Mary Nisbet, Lady Elgin, so Lord Elgin's wife, which contextualizes her husband's interest in the Parthenon marbles. And whilst Lord Elgin had used his own funds to acquire the Parthenon friezes, he was only able to do so because he was the British ambassador at Constantinople. And he thus was particularly able to benefit from the weakened political position of the Sultan when he applied for the permission. And so the excitement of this diplomatic success was communicated in a letter from his wife that she sent to her parents in July 1801, where she says, "I'm happy to tell you that Pisani has succeeded a merveille in his firman with the port." The firman was the actual document. It's kind of, in Italian, a firman is like a signature. The firman was the document signed by the Sultan or some of his close dependents that gave permission to do whatever they needed to do. So it allows our artists to go into the citadel and copy and model everything in it, to dig and discover all the ancient foundations and to bring away any marbles that might be deemed curious by their having inscriptions on them. I'm in the greatest glee, for it would have been a great pity to have failed in the principal point after having been at such an expense. But any pretense that Elgin was unaware that taking the friezes would spoil the monuments of its most beautiful attributes can be dispelled by the letter that his private secretary received from Ioannis Venizelos, a schoolmaster in Athens. Venizelos wrote, "One thing, however, would upset you very much, as it would anyone who has the slightest understanding of these things." He was saying everything is going well in Athens, apart from this. The last deplorable to the point of tears stripping of the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis, like a noble and opulent lady who has lost all of her diamonds and jewelry. It is important to understand that Elgin's collection had not been commissioned by the museum, but its eventual acquisition changed the perception of how antiquities could be obtained. So my second example is drawn from correspondence in the Egypt and Sudan department relating to acquisition from British consul Harry Salt and Italian engineer and showman Giovanni Belzoni. The letters show the seeds of the idea of institutional collecting. So this is Henry Salt, Levant Company consul appointed in Alexandria in 1815. He oversaw the period of change between the Levant Company and the Foreign Office, when the Foreign Office took over the consular service. And this is Giovanni Belzoni, who was initially a circus strongman, but he was an engineer, Italian engineer, gone to Egypt to do watering plant for the authorities there, but then fell out with them, was left without money, and so started to excavate. And Belzoni had an exceptional, because he was an engineer, an exceptional understanding of how to find things and excavate them, and he had a lot of success. So the relationship between Salt, Belzoni, and the museum was fraught with complexity and misunderstandings. When Salt arrived in Egypt in 1815, he contacted Belzoni to collect antiquities for the British Museum, but failed to mention that there was actually no direct arrangement between himself and the trustees, but just an amicable request from St. Joseph Bank, somebody he knew and who was an important trustee. However, banks had not cleared this with the trustees. So it appears that Salt intended Belzoni to be at his own service to collect items which he could then sell to the museum for profit. However, as soon as they had amassed a collection, Salt made a major misjudgment by sending a list, which you see here, of antiquities with prices. You can see the number, description, price, to William Hamilton, who was the permanent Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs. The list was passed to the museum with disastrous consequences for Salt. This was simply not done to ask for money to the museum. This document painted a picture of Salt as an opportunist, and the archives contain a large number of letters where, having tainted his reputation at the museum, he tried to set the record straight. So Salt wrote to Hamilton, "You will find my letter to be that of a person consulting with a friend rather than containing a regular proposal." So he was saying, you know, I was just telling you this, that maybe this could be an indicative price. Unfortunately, it now seems to have been coupled with the rough inventory I sent you, giving an idea of my private estimation of the several articles. A foolish document, I have confessed. Thus, I'm sought, I understand, to have become a dealer, a Jew, a second Lord Elgin, and the Lord knows how many other shocking appellations. Further confusing matters, Belzoni himself was under the impression that he could go behind Salt's back and get directly employed by the trustees of the museum. Therefore, again, with much ingenuity, he wrote them a candid letter setting out his costs. "I understand that it is the wish of Sir Joseph Bank that I should enter into an arrangement with the trustees of the British Museum to employ myself in excavating and collecting antiquities in Egypt. I should feel myself highly honored in engaging with the state trustees for the period of 2 years, promising that I would endeavor to do the best, to the best of my knowledge, to employ the above time in the most minute researches." So, having made a calculation of the expenses necessary for such an undertaking, I find that on the most economical system, they would amount to the sum of £1,500 per annum, excluding the necessary presents to the base, HECF, and so on of the country. But although Egyptian art was at the time largely believed to be the work of barbarians and of interest primarily as curiosities, correspondence reveals a growing appreciation of its importance. one of the trustees, Lord Morris, writing in support of Salt to Joseph Bank, noted that the Greeks were evidently pupils of the Egyptians, as he could trace from the works he had showed him, the Athenian works of Phidias. So the British Museum refused to buy the collection with the prices. But although they refused to buy the antiquities outright, the trustees did eventually agree to help with their transport back from Egypt, believing that they would then be destined for the museum. So the reasoning behind this was, we transport them back, so they then belong to us. However, when the pieces finally arrived in England, there was confusion as to whom they belonged. There was also a misunderstanding with Belzoni about the sale of a particularly precious sarcophagus called the Sarcophagus of Seti, an amazing alabaster piece. If any of you has been to the Johnson Museum, it's in the basement there. The entire museum is built around this piece. And I believe that the reason for it eventually ending up in the Johnson Museum was this disagreement about buying things and how much they should pay for things. So at this stage, Salt asked for a fair valuation. He was essentially desperate. The British Museum was simply not going to pay the kind of prices that Salt and Belzoni had based their plans on. So he writes this other letter to the trustees. But in trying to sell the antiquities to the museum, Salt stated that he would accept any price because, having used up his inheritance to fund the excavations, he was by now penniless. So Salt opportunism in thinking he could exploit his diplomatic position to procure a steady income and guarantee his future by providing antiquities to the museum demonstrated, however, how in principle diplomats could be used to furnish the museum with antiquities. It illustrated the beginning of a two-way exchange between the museum and those willing to collect, even if the nature and typology of reward was at this stage unclear. So, in other words, Elgin had been unlucky because he collected with his own money, then he managed to sell to the British Museum for pretty much as he had spent. Salt used his own inheritance to excavate for the museum, thinking he could make money, and he didn't. And then we get to somebody else. So a further fundamental step in the development of a mutual system involving the diplomatic service in the procurement of antiquities for the museum was the appointment of Harry Austin Layard. A letter in the Department of Middle East, which he wrote in 1849, whilst he was still a traveler in the East, but after his first excavation. So Layard took himself to the East, found a plain near Mosul where he thought he could find a particular palace he was looking for. And after just one day of digging, he found a palace. And he had great success. And at this point, he had credibility in showing that he could find things. So in this letter, he explains his willingness to undertake further works, but laments that the sums offered by the museum were so inadequate and that the result was doubtful. He noted that there was no prospect of personal advantage, either in diplomacy or reputation, and if he was to continue, he would want an undertaking from the government that his service to the trustees should count as seniority in the diplomatic profession. In other words, he was saying, okay, I continue to excavate for you. I find pieces for the museum, but you guarantee me a career. I want an appointment in the diplomatic service, and I want to be able to progress in the service. His letter seems to have paid off because 5 weeks later, another letter informed the trustees that Layard had been appointed paid attaché at Constantinople on a salary of £250 a year. If the work of searching antiquities is continued, Layard will be put at the trustees' disposal. When the trustees' proposals are known, Palmerston will instruct Canning to approach the port. So therefore, Layard's diplomatic appointment was specifically created to allow him to collect antiquities for the British Museum. But the person who was responsible for connecting the Foreign Office and the British Museum into an effective agency for the collection of antiquities was Charles Thomas Newton, this gentleman you can see here. Initially an assistant at the British Museum, having learned from the experience of Elgin, Salt and Layard, Newton asked for and obtained a diplomatic posting in Aegean in 1852. He was accompanied by Dominic Ellis Colnaghi, whose families were art dealers in Bond Street. I shall tell you a few more things about this. So why in the Aegean in 1852? Because when Greece became independent, the first law they promulgated was a law protecting their antiquities after the obstacle of the Elgin marbles. So Greece became a cut-off territory as far as the British, the French, and everybody else was concerned to collect antiquities. But the Aegean Islands had been left out of the new Kingdom of Greece. So they were still part of the Ottoman Empire. And so they remained as the most important places to find Greek antiquities at this stage. So this is why Newton, having observed all that had happened until then, understood that if he resigned from the museum, got an appointment through Panizzi, who was then principal librarian, it's like saying the director of the British Museum, as a vice consul rather than a consul, he could go and look for antiquities and then offer his services to the museum. In this, he was accompanied by this young gentleman, Dominic Ellis Colnaghi, who then started a career in the Foreign Office himself. So, I'm sorry, probably I jumped a whole piece. Whilst there, Newton met, advised and organized the local consuls to become agents for the collection of antiquities for the museum. And after a brief posting as consul general in Rome, where he went to examine a collection of antiquities, on his return to Britain in 1861, he secured the keepership of the newly formed Department of Greek and Roman Antiquities. In his 6 years diplomatic career, Newton had achieved so much more that he could have hoped to achieve in a lifetime working at the museum. In 1863, he wrote draft instructions to consuls for the Foreign Office, institutionalizing the search and retrieval of antiquities as one of the official duties of British consuls in the Ottoman Empire. Newton continued to direct the search for antiquities behind the scene, and by this time, the golden age of collecting was in full swing. And whilst the Ottoman authorities started to extend access to excavations to other powers, they had become aware of the value of findings for their own museum. At the same time, in the newly unified Italy, the antiquities market had begun to freeze up because the new government had legislated to prevent the export of archaeological finds, which were instead destined to their regional museums. So this delicate set of coincidences sets the background to my final example, which combines acquisitions, consuls, and intense diplomatic activities to convince the trustees to spend money for an entire collection in order to obtain one very special piece, the Satala head or Satala Aphrodite. This is an article I've written, which in fact I've just heard today. It will be published in the Journal of the History of Collections soon. It's a very long story. I will say it in a few words here. So the collection was that of Alessandro Castellani, the descendant of a family of famous Italian jewelers. He had been trying to sell his gold and gems to the museum since 1865. But the government had repeatedly failed to commit the money. So they kept saying, yes, we're interested. Yes, we'll buy the collection. But it had been many years and Castellani was still waiting. The situation changed following his purchase of a rare Greek bronze, which seemed to have attracted Newton's particular interest and which he became determined to secure for the British Museum. So this had this Satana Aphrodite. Whilst Castellani gold objects had been deposited at the museum in 1871, the bronze head with other antiquities was still in Rome, and Newton traveled there in 1872 to inspect it. And he noted that it has more of the manners of the great artists of Athens than any extant sculpture. And it is the more precious because in the works of Phidias, in the pediments of the Parthenon, the bodies only have been preserved. So in other words, and Newton wrote also an article on the newspaper telling the story of this head and why it was important to acquire it for the British Museum, because he said the only extant species we have of the school of Phidias have got no heads, whilst instead this piece seems to be from the same school and is a very rare example of a head. So Newton reported that this bronze had recently been sold to Castellani by Potiadis Bey. Potiadis Bey was the Turkish minister at Florence. And in Florence, Newton's ex-assistant, Dominic Ellis Cornaghi, was at this time consul general. So Newton's network of connections in the Ottoman Empire was at work to secure this piece, even in Italy. Newton was so determined to obtain it that he wrote to Gladstone, then Prime Minister, explaining that Castellani's collection contained a bronze head of Venus of heroic size, which is, to my mind, the finest example of Greek work in metal I've ever seen. Indeed, I may say, the work which in beauty of conception and mastery of execution has most claim to rank next to the marbles of the Parthenon. Obsessed with this bronze head, Newton tasked Alfred Biliotti, this gentleman here, British Vice Consul at Rhodes, to find the story behind it, with the intention of locating the rest of the statue. So in a museum committee meeting on the 28th of March 1874, Newton submitted 2 letters from Biliotti stating that he had received information that the large bronze head recently acquired by the museum had been found, together with a hand, again in bronze, at or near Satala in Armenia, and that other interesting discoveries might be made in the same location. Newton recommended that Biliotti should be asked to proceed to Satala, now called Sadak, with an allowance of £100. From there, Biliotti sent the museum a 63-page report of where the head and its accompanying hand had been found, and on how the sculptures had found a way via the governor of the town, to the governor general of Erzurum, to the government accountant at Constantinople, and eventually to Potiadis Bey, who had taken it to Italy, and then taken it to Rome, where it had been sold to Castellani. And it is worth noting that at the same time, an antiquity found in the Ottoman Empire had to be taken to the museum at Constantinople by decree of the Sultan. This head instead disappeared in transit to the museum, only to appear on the open market in Italy. Then it must be noted that by Italian legislation of the time, this head should not have left the territory of Italy. Instead, it found its way to London with the rest of the Castellani collection. And in the article, I explain how and why and so on. In fact, in further correspondence and looking for connected and similar pieces, Newton was informed by the secretary to the British Embassy at Constantinople that the ambassador must ask leave to purchase and bring away the statue as a special favor from the Sultan, because in the present temper of the Turks, as regards antiquities, it can be done in no other way. So the extensive correspondence relating to this Atala head shows how Newton and the museum made full use of the machinery of the diplomatic service, directing consuls on the ground and gathering intelligence relating to antiquities and how they might be procured. Yet, when we go to the museum, this is the label you can see. Head of a bronze sculpted statue of Anahita, a local goddess shown here in the guise of Aphrodite. no description about its importance, why they desperately wanted it at the museum, the fact that it's one of the few existing bronze heads of the School of Fidia, and so on. We know nothing from this label. And so one of the aim, and this is the head of Anaita and the hand in a side room in the British Museum. So if you didn't know it, you wouldn't know how to find it, and you wouldn't know of its importance from the way it is shown and where it is located. And so one of the aims of the pilot project has been to show how material in the British Museum archives illuminates the attitudes, behavior, and policies behind the acquisitions, and how they shaped both the way the museum developed and the collections it acquired. These documents tell the story of the determination to build a museum with the best pieces, but with the least expense, involving governmental effort at a variety of different levels to obtain permissions, get the manpower to excavate, transport, and bring to the museum the pieces. It is a story of an initially casual, but later precisely coordinated mutual effort to make things possible, economical, yet grandiose. The story for this research project I undertook is clearly fragmented, yet it reveals the intertwining of the museum with the government and of the government with the museum, and shows clearly why this history is important, to understand what happened and to imagine a future for the museum that rewrites the narrative with a more ethical approach. And this is where I end.
Thank you so much. And we have a question already, in matter of fact, from the people who are watching us. And the question is from Christine, and she said, how is the British Museum dealing with the present vogue of returning certain items to their original countries?
This is a difficult issue. It's okay, how do I put this? It's, you know, that there has been a long report written by Sarre and Savoy in France about restitution to African countries.
Yeah.
This started a discourse about restitution. Projects like this, like the one I've done, and that we're still trying to put together in a grander scale, aim to tell the real story behind the putting together the collections. And this is definitely something that the museum intends to do. But there are a number of things. First of all, the British Museum was created by Act of Parliament. And there is the Museum Act, I think 1963, that says that the museum cannot deaccession, so therefore cannot get rid of pieces unless they are unusable, ruined beyond repair, or useless. And this was extended to the other museums in this country. So it would require a change of legislation specifically for the British Museum, but also for other museums, to give back pieces. Of course, there could be other ways. There is the way of, I don't know, digital 3D reconstruction, traveling exhibitions, but the first way is conversation. And this is a long story. Unfortunately, what happened in this country last week, I'm writing an article with a colleague about the massacre in Ethiopia. And last week there was a meeting between the culture minister and museum, how did they put it, a museum professionals or the museum sector, where, and after he tweeted that they had decided that things were not going back, and that we're now concentrating on how to communicate that things are not going back, but we are telling the story. So there is a lot of goodwill from the museum sector, and there is not very much goodwill from the politicians. Yeah. And it depends from which politicians, because for an example, one reason why Corbyn wasn't liked in this country was that he said, if I become prime minister, we'll talk about the return of the Elgin marbles. But it's a conflicting and difficult subject.
Because even obviously with the study that you've done and you showed all over the time and how the British Museum developed, we can even go back in time and see that the history of collecting things, it's since ever. Now, in terms of the ethical issues that the museums face nowadays, and British Museum will be one of them, obviously. Do you think, on your opinion, if I may ask, obviously, Dr. Lucia, do you think that some part of collections or some collections should be delegated, or at least give it back to their country of origin? Or, by the other hand, because of a question of protection, depending of the circumstances that that country is going through, if we should keep it to save that piece of history? I know it's a quite difficult question, by the way.
It is a difficult question, and I will reply in a diplomatic way, which is that there are two types of acquisitions. There are acquisitions that are important and represent fundamental pieces of identification for provenance countries. And those are the ones that should be discussed about. So for an example, if we talk about human remains, or if we talk about statues and gods and things that are of primary importance to other people, then a discussion should certainly be had, and a correct way forward has to be found. The correct way forward might be to involve communities to return the pieces. Some countries are deciding to do so, or if they can't be returned, at least the story has to be told in its own entirety without embellishment, because in most cases these stories are the stories I tell of the Ottoman Empire are not too difficult. They're mainly stories of diplomacy and how to get permission and how to bring them. Nobody was killed to get these things. But the stories of the pieces in Africa tell a very different story, and that's much more difficult to confront in a way. And so something has to happen, because it is clear that there are very strong ethical issues in the way museums are organized today. And it is clear that the story that has been told this far or presented is the story from the Western point of view, from the conqueror's point of view. So we need to be able to tell the story from both sides. And at least we owe this to society, both to societies in Western Europe and to societies of provenance countries, because at least that establishes an element of fairness, of justice.
True.
So I've replied to your question, but not.
No. It is a perfect answer. And Pedro has as well a question, and this reports to your presentation. Basically, at a certain point, you show a book, the presentation book, the inventory record book. He was asking if you know if the ink of that book, it was iron galc ink, because it's so very well maintained and so very well preserved.
I wouldn't know, to be honest, but yes, it is very well maintained. These documents, haven't seen very many, or not very many people have seen these documents. I was very lucky to do this project, and hopefully we will continue and do more. But no, I wouldn't know which ink they used. I'm sorry.
And just one more question in terms of the collections, for example, and obviously again touching the British Museum, and how does it work in terms of the collections that they are on the museum? There is a sort of rotation, so people can have access to more and more over the years.
Or... I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure there will be some element of rotation, but this is exactly the point I was researching with a colleague for another article, not to do with the British Museum at all. That essentially all museums have got so much storage and so many things that are not on show. And this is exactly one element that one could discuss about the fact that these things that are not on storage, maybe they could be part of the discussion. And if they've been in the basement of museums for the best part of 100 years and nobody has looked at them, they're very important for somebody else. So for an example, one of the reasons why one of my research and interest focus is the disaster and reconstruction is because I come from a town that had a huge earthquake. It's called L'Aquila in 2009. And after the earthquake, a lot of things disappeared because, as I just told you, cultural heritage disappears when there are difficult political circumstances, war, or natural disaster. And of course, after the earthquake, a lot of things disappeared from L'Aquila. And then people from L'Aquila, activists, started a group on Facebook called I Want It Back in L'Aquila. And one of the things they wanted back are some lions that disappeared before the First World War, but that are first were on show at the Getty Museum in Malibu, but now are in the basement. And so they're not even on show. And I did a bit of research. I contacted the museum. I explained the thing. They sent me the documentation they had. I then sent it to somebody who works for the Ministry of Culture in Italy. To make a long story short, now a formal restitution has been done from one state to the other to get the lions back, and hopefully will be accepted and they will return. But so they were in the basement, so they're not even being used by the museum. Whilst for L'Aquila, they would mean a lot because they're a symbol of the town. There are a number of these lions around town, and they would mean a lot.
We don't want to keep you more than you should because it's late as well. And like we promised, it will be 1 hour. But I will leave Bruno with our last question for you, Dr. Lucia. Bruno?
So, good night, Dr. Lucia. I have a question that is in the concept of museum. Should we review the concept of museum? Many scholars have their opinion, but I want to know some about this topic.
there is a lot of discussion in this.
Thank you.
Because there are also a lot of different museums, you know. So effectively what the British Museum is an encyclopedic museum. It's a museum that shows the history of civilization of the world and its art in all the different forms. There are lots of different types of museums, but one thing I can tell you is that ICOM has been discussing the new museum definition now for 2 years. So 2 years ago in Kyoto in 2019, the delegate, a museum definition had been prepared, but then the delegates couldn't agree about it because of all these issues of restitution and fairness and justice and recognizing what should need, necessary steps that need to be taken for society to come to terms with a difficult history. And so now there's a consultation. They're asking everybody to give their idea of what the new museum definition should say. And we have until the end of March to send back a document. And we had a meeting this week, actually, where I did say a lot about human remains, fairness, looking at what particular pieces means for certain societies, and understanding that their point of view needs to be considered, needs to be taken into consideration. So it's a difficult step to do. I don't think the museum should be reconsidered as such, because they've been an important element of education and research and development of informing taste, of educating people. Museums have great social functions and so on. But we must find a way to overcome what I used to say to my students all the time when I was teaching the history of collecting, was that we need to find a better way to make the step into the 21st century, because museums at the moment are still telling the same story that they told in the 19th century. They haven't gone forward. And that story has to change, has to modernize, has to take account of what really happened.
True. Thank you so much once again, Dr. Lucia,
You're welcome.
for being with us, for taking from your time. And we hope to hear a little bit more about your works very soon. And thank you for accepting our invite. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching us. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.